really focused on three things. One is I speak all over the world. Really, it's thought leadership in marketing and sales. So it's looking at what's happening in the world with technology, with customer expectations, and reacting to that, and working with companies to help them improve that. So that's what the main topics of the talks are. And then I consult, which is really about the same thing, but that's the application of it. So I'll go into a business and work with them mainly at a very strategic level on their sales and marketing. And then the other thing I do is write. So at the moment I'm writing a fifth book, which hopefully will be out early next year, early 2019. But that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Okay. Now, I know that you are highly creative, and what I notice with a lot of highly creative people is that they're not as good in their persuasion skills. And you talk about speaking at conferences all around the world, which it gives you a platform for being persuasive. Now, do you think that, the persuasion skills is a very different kind of skill to creativity, or do you think that they can go hand in hand?
Wow, that's a very, very interesting question. So I think they can go hand in hand, because I would say that there are whole areas of the world where communication skills and creativity go hand in hand. I'll give you an example. Take musicians. If you take songwriters like Bob Dylan or David Bowie, they're the immediate ones that spring to mind, but there's many, many others. They are obviously incredible creatives and at the same time incredible communicators, which is why they've got a platform. So I think they can go hand in hand. Having said that, I suppose there are times when they don't, which is why you'll have creatives that just write, or you'll have creatives that are in the background, and there are probably many more creatives in the background working in the arts and all sorts of other disciplines rather than in the foreground. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, I suppose, would be the answer to the question. I suppose it's how that creativity comes across. For me, I'd say my core skills are a communicator and a creative. And perhaps that's true of some of those musicians. Whereas I suppose there are other people that have another blend of talents. It might be creativity with something else, which isn't necessarily communication.
So how is it that you are able to be persuasive about the value of your books?
That's a good question. For me, it's about passion. So for me, it's about, I've never written a book because it seemed like a good idea. I wrote a book because I had something to say. And actually there was about 3 years, you have to forgive me because the timelines sometimes disappear a bit, but there were about 3 years between my first book and my second book, because I didn't feel like I had much to say at the time. So I think if you're passionate about what you do, it helps, because when you talk about being persuasive, I think that energy itself is persuasive. In other words, enthusiasm in and of itself can be very persuasive. If someone really believes in what they're doing and that comes across, and that can already pique someone's interest. So I think that really believing in what you're doing makes a huge difference. And I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive as well. So I would imagine someone that makes a living, for example, writing TV dramas or whatever else. It may be that, look, I need to write my next TV drama because I need to be able to pay the bills in the next 2 or 3 years. But then they still may find a project that they suddenly get invigorated about, enthusiastic about, excited about. I think perhaps where it may go wrong is when someone is doing it in a formula, they're painting by numbers, as it were, because perhaps they haven't found that spark for the next drama and they've got to write it anyway. But I think I think the other thing about someone that's very, very creative is there is always another idea. There is always something. In fact, one of the challenges I think sometimes about being a creative is about seeing a project through. Because I think sometimes if you're very creative, you can get very, very distractive, and then you get in your own way because you almost don't finish the first thing before you're onto the second one, which might make life a lot of fun, but is a problem in terms of, from a commercial perspective, actually getting something out, as it were, into a marketplace.
Absolutely. Yes, because ideas on their own are not creativity. Ideas need to be processed, they need to be evaluated, they need to go through that whole process for it to result in something which is useful and which is original. Whereas a lot of people, as you say, you know, we have thousands of ideas, but they're not necessarily good ideas. They're not necessarily useful ideas. They might be useful to us, but not useful to anybody else.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, so I think I agree with that. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think creativity, it's interesting how you define creativity. Can you be creative without producing anything of worth at the end? I don't know. It's an interesting point. It's an interesting perspective. I would dare I say it, maybe you can, but you can't share it with others. So then you have to talk about, you know, in terms of its enduring worth. It has to be able to be something that's shared and communicated, doesn't it? Otherwise, there's no enduring worth to it at all. It's very interesting, and it's something that I haven't perhaps thought about as much as you have, but it's very interesting to see how you define originality as well. Because you could say there are things that have been creative. Some pop music springs to mind. I'm not sure if I want to name names, but I'm sure everybody will be able to think of their own examples in their mind. But there are examples in pop music, I would say, where it's the music has definitely had a value because it's sold in hundreds of thousands of units or streamed in hundreds of thousands of units. So for someone there was a value, otherwise they wouldn't have streamed it. But in terms of its originality, you could say it was quite derivative of many other things that came before it. So it depends how you define that originality. I mean, it was original in that it had never been quite done in that way before, which is why the people didn't get sued. You know, but I'm not sure it was original in terms of, well, we've heard a lot of things very similar. Yeah. So I suppose it depends how you interpret the word original, isn't it?
And also that that academic definition that creativity needs to be original and it needs to have value, that's a very basic, it's a very rustic definition, it's very limited. And this is why systems thinkers, for example, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, argue that, well, we have to think about, well, original to whom, of value to, you know, to who. And he says, like, well, society needs to evaluate, the culture needs to evaluate the worth of that idea. So the music that you talk about, maybe 50 years ago, that same music might not have, it might just have been noise in a different location, in a different time space. Society would have evaluated that as being, you know, not worth listening to. Whereas when the time is right, when somebody's in the right time, in the right place, then, you know, society will say, yes, that's very creative. It's new in the form that, you know, we're listening to it. It wasn't played in that same form previously.
I agree. And actually, you bring up an interesting point, because context in creativity matters, doesn't it? Yeah. And you see things like that I'm sure people have experienced when they've gone traveling and experienced other cultures and other countries, where something that really is fantastic in the moment, when you're in the place, if you bring it back to where it's back to your own country, sometimes it doesn't translate for you. And I mean for you, I don't mean for anybody else, but even back in your sort of living room at home, it doesn't translate in the same way once you're in a different climate, a different culture, back to what I call your normal everyday existence. But contextually, in the moment, it was amazing, and it was an amazing experience. So I think you're right.
Yeah, that's a great example. You know, so in the right place, in the right time, and in its context, it was beautiful. But take it outside of its context, and, you know, it's just kitsch, basically.
Yeah. and that's again when you have cultural movements as well, when of their time were so important, but maybe 10 or 20 years later don't really translate at all, because they were very much of their time. Whereas you'll have other cultures and movements that seem to translate over decades or even millennia. I mean, for example, you take classical music like Beethoven or Mozart or others, they still speak to many, many people on, today, hundreds of years after those symphonies, operas, etc. were created. Whereas you can think of other types of music that just don't translate at all, even 10 or 20 years later.
Yeah. And Grant, because you work in so many different, you work with a global audience, you speak not just in England, in different places. What do you think helps to be so adaptable? Because I think that's what, for creativity, there needs to be this kind of adaptability. What do you do that makes you adapt the knowledge that you have so that it's appropriate for different cultures?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think there are two things. One is deliberate and one isn't. So the deliberate thing is to take an interest in where you're going to be, because that's appreciated. So, and these days, dare I say, it's fairly easy to do it. Unfortunately, I often don't get time to spend a lot of time in the places that I'm going. It can literally be a flying visit. I can be there for 48 hours. Obviously, in an ideal world, I'd love to experience some of the places I've been to. And it's almost a crime that I haven't had the chance to experience those places. But those are sometimes commercial realities. But I think, today with things like Google and Wikipedia and others, you can actually go online and have a look and take an interest before you go. And actually, sometimes that gives you an idea of the sort of questions you should be asking when you do start to speak to, often for me, it's local business people, but I'm still speaking to local business people, and I can talk to them about what's going on politically, what's going on culturally. And it just gives you an understanding. And obviously, you don't pretend to be even remotely an expert, not even close. You're just a novice. But the fact that you've taken an interest and you have start to get some understanding, I think does change. But the other thing, which I think is one of those things, I think it's a core tenet of creativity, and I don't think you can teach it, but I may be wrong about that, which is empathy, which is having a natural empathy for your audience. And whether that audience is a listening audience that you never meet, or whether it's an audience that, you're flying into a country to give a presentation like I often am, and you're meeting that audience almost for the first time. The ability to perhaps talk to the room, over a coffee or whatever before it starts, the event starts or whatever else, and get a feel. I don't mean any sort of proper understanding in terms of logic, but in terms of emotional understanding and empathy for that audience. And I think perhaps the best presenters in all walks of life seem to have it. And without being too political, I think some of the most gifted politicians in the world over the decades also have had it, the ability to walk into a room and just have a feel for that audience and almost know the right thing to say, or at least the right way to put something and communicate it in the right way. And you can call it a form of manipulation if it's not careful. And I suppose it can be abused. But I think that empathy for your audience is very important part of creative, because you need to be able to touch others, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. And as you were talking and you mentioned the word politics, of course, I thought about Donald Trump. He is renowned for knowing exactly what his audience wants to hear. And so the creativity is not just at the thought level, it's also at the feeling level. And I think that's where maybe some people, they concentrate just on the cognitive problem solving ability, and it's that empathy, it's being able to feel your audience and know what they want, basically. And that can be positive and negative. It just depends on the perspective that you're taking, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it changes in two different ways, because if you think about it, you take a politician or any presenter, any speaker who has the ability to walk into a room and have an innate understanding at an emotional level of that room and how they're feeling and the mood, and be able to take that mood and therefore convey their message in a way that works. And then you have artists that speak perennially to the human condition. They're almost just in touch with the human condition. And again, you take great writers, be it, you know, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, or Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen, or people that manage to speak to that innate humanity, and their songs, you know, there'll be people in 2018, 2019 that will discover Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen or any of these great artists for the first time. And even though they come from a completely different generation at a completely different moment in history, that almost innate humanity speaks to those people. And I always talk in terms of music because it's something I'm very interested in and love, but it can be great art. It can be, it doesn't, obviously it can be any type of format.
Yeah, you've touched on another important criteria of creativity, which is permanence. That, you know, the systems thinkers say that when creativity, when we label something as creative, it needs to create that indelible mark on society and culture. So those musicians that you talked about, their influence, we cannot erase their influence. It's part of our culture.
Yeah, I agree. And even sometimes, actually, even moments in time that perhaps don't translate later on still have a degree of permanence, because without that piece of the jigsaw, we wouldn't be where we are today. So if I can, it'd be amazing how many people remember this, but if you take a movement like Acid House, with the smiley faces, if you remember that, that was a moment in time. And I'm not sure that translates today. I don't think many people, not that I'm aware of anyway, listen to much Acid House anymore. But without that movement, modern dance music, as where it is today, wouldn't be there. So I'd still call that a degree of permanence, because if you like, that conversation that takes place over the generations, it was an important part of that conversation, albeit it might be something that's been left behind now. I think the two things I would say is the authenticity of your creativity. Don't be frightened. I think sometimes people, if they're doing something that's a bit risque or different or daring, people worry and they try and tone themselves down. And I think there's a shame in that. So I think the authenticity in whatever you're doing, in whatever way you're being creative, I think is very, very important. And the other thing is which we haven't touched on, is the willingness to fail. Because actually creativity is a process and you don't get it right all the time. And actually you might get it wrong more times than you get it right. But that willingness to fail allows you to be creative, gives you the freedom to be creative. And I think sometimes people are so worried, certainly I've worked with colleagues, where they're so worried not to fail, they limit the ambition of what they can achieve. And I think that's sad.
Absolutely, Grant. Yeah, because a lot of people think that taking risks, they don't realize that when you take risks, you're not always going to succeed. You know, inherent in taking risks is that the likelihood that very often you might fail.
Yeah, 100%. I think the willingness to do that and not worry about failing gives you the freedom to then create something truly remarkable.
Yeah.